My billionaire CEO father shattered his crystal champagne flute against the marble floor before hurling a 50-page prenuptial agreement directly at my fiance. The thick stack of legal papers hit Liam in the chest and scattered everywhere like confetti. My father pointed a trembling finger at him and announced to 200 of New York's most elite socialites that the man I loved was a gold-digging parasite who fixed computers for a living. He looked me dead in the eye and gave his final ultimatum. Call off this wedding right now, or you will not get a single cent from me, and you are dead to this family. The entire room gasped. But Liam did not flinch. He just calmly squeezed my hand, smiled at me, and said, "We do not need their money, Allison." 2 years later, my father's shipping empire was crumbling into absolute bankruptcy. And that same arrogant billionaire was on his knees sobbing and begging my husband to sign a bailout contract to save his life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have ever been underestimated, humiliated, or cast aside by the very people who were supposed to protect you. Growing up as the daughter of Richard Harrison meant that love was always conditional, and affection was just another business transaction. But nothing prepared me for the sheer cruelty of that Friday night. I am Allison, and at the time of this disaster, I was 33 years old. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove my worth to a family that only valued me for my financial acumen. As the director of acquisitions for Harrison Global Logistics, I had doubled my father's profit margins in 3 years, but none of that mattered to him. In his eyes, I was just a pawn meant to be married off to another corporate dynasty to merge assets. When I brought Liam home, a quiet, incredibly intelligent, independent software developer, my father saw red. To Richard, anyone who did not wear a bespoke suit and command a boardroom was a peasant. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration, but my father turned it into a public execution. The Plaza Hotel ballroom was decorated with thousands of white roses, and the tables were draped in imported silk. We had just finished the main course when my father stood up at the head table. Everyone assumed he was going to give a touching toast. Instead, he signaled his corporate lawyer, who handed him a thick, leather-bound folder. The room fell into a hush as my father took the microphone. He did not speak about my childhood or his hopes for my future. He spoke about asset protection. He looked out at the sea of guests consisting of politicians, hedge fund managers, and socialites. Then he turned his cold glare toward Liam. He announced loudly into the microphone that he had run a background check on Liam. He mocked the fact that Liam drove a 5-year-old sedan and lived in a modest apartment. He called his independent software business a glorified IT hobby. My father laughed, a cruel booming sound that bounced off the crystal chandeliers. He told the crowd that Liam was nothing but a parasite looking for a free ride on the Harrison family fortune. The humiliation was physically painful. My face burned as 200 pairs of eyes shifted toward me, filled with pity and amusement. I could hear the whispers traveling from table to table. I looked at my mother, Patricia, begging her silently to intervene. My mother sat perfectly still, wearing her signature pearl necklace and a custom designer gown. She did not look angry at my father. She looked annoyed with me. She leaned over her plate of roasted pheasant, grabbed my wrist with a tight, painful grip, and whispered sharply, "You are making a scene, Allison. Stop crying and do what your father says. You are embarrassing the entire family over a man who cannot even afford to buy you a proper house." I stared at her in shock. My own mother was more concerned about the optics of the dinner party than the fact that my heart was breaking. She took a delicate sip of her red wine and turned her head away, entirely dismissing my existence. The silence in the room was suffocating. I felt like I was standing entirely alone on a stage while a crowd waited to watch me burn. My father stepped away from the microphone and walked directly up to us. That is when he slammed his champagne flute onto the ground and threw the prenuptial agreement. The papers slid across the polished marble floor, stopping at the polished shoes of the guests. "Sign it," he demanded. "Sign away any right to the Harrison Trust, the estate, and my company. If you do not sign it, then you walk out of those doors right now and you leave everything behind. Your job, your trust fund, your car, everything. You choose right now, Allison, the beggar or your blood. Just as I opened my mouth to defend Liam, a loud mocking laugh cut through the tension. It was my younger sister, the golden child of the family, and her new husband, Jamal. Jamal stepped forward, adjusting his expensive silk tie. My father had just handed Jamal the vice president of finance position, a role I had worked 80-hour weeks for 10 years to earn. Jamal looked Liam up and down with utter disgust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill and tossed it so it fluttered down onto Liam's chest. "Get yourself a real drink, ite guy." Jamal smirked. "Or maybe buy a better suit. You look like you just got off a shift at the mall." My sister giggled, clinging to Jamal's arm. She looked at me with that same smug expression she had worn since childhood. "Just listen to Daddy, Allison," she chimed in. "You are acting crazy. Do not throw away your inheritance for a guy who fixes broken keyboards." I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. For years I had taken their insults. I had smiled through the holidays while they belittled my career. I had swallowed my pride when my father promoted Jamal over me, despite Jamal costing the company $4 million in a disastrous third-quarter accounting error. An error that I had to secretly fix to save his job. I had done it all for the sake of family loyalty. But looking at Jamal smirking at Liam and looking at my father standing there like a tyrant demanding worship, I realized I had no family. I had a group of leeches who wore designer clothes. I did not scream. I did not cry. I reached up to my neck and unclasped the heavy $50,000 diamond necklace my father had given me as an early wedding gift. The heavy jewels felt like a collar. I let the necklace slide through my fingers and drop directly into my father's half-empty champagne glass on the table. It landed with a heavy clink, splashing the expensive liquor onto the white tablecloth. I looked at my father and spoke clearly enough for the front row of tables to hear. "I quit the company, Richard. Let Jamal handle the quarterly audits from now on. We will see how long the company survives without me covering up his million-dollar mistakes." Jamal's smug smile vanished instantly. His face went completely pale as several board members seated nearby suddenly leaned in, whispering furiously to one another. My father opened his mouth to shout, but I was already turning away. I looked at Liam. My brilliant, patient, wonderful Liam, who had not raised his voice or lost his temper once. He just reached out and took my hand. His grip was warm and solid, anchoring me in the storm. "We do not need their money, Allison." Liam said, his voice steady and calm. "Let us go home." We turned our backs on the billionaires, the socialites, the fake friends, and the toxic family. We walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, stepping right over the scattered pages of the prenuptial agreement. My father began screaming behind me, threatening to freeze my bank accounts and ruin my reputation in the financial district. My mother gasped in horror at my defiance, but I did not look back. With every step toward those heavy oak doors, the weight of 33 years of emotional abuse began to lift off my shoulders. I was walking away from a massive fortune, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely free. The doors closed shut behind us, cutting off my father's furious screaming. The night air of New York City hit my face, and I knew my life was about to change forever. I just had no idea how massive and devastating my revenge would eventually be. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing endlessly. It was not my family calling to apologize. It was a barrage of automated alerts from my bank. Every single account with my name on it had been frozen. I threw off the covers and walked to the window of Liam's modest apartment just in time to see a tow truck pulling away with my leased luxury car. My father had wasted no time. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop to check my work email. A bold red error message flashed across the screen, informing me that my corporate credentials had been permanently revoked. Richard Harrison did not just fire me, he was trying to erase me from existence. I was not going to let him win. I had an Ivy League degree and a decade of experience dominating corporate finance. I put on my best tailored suit and spent the next 2 weeks marching into every major financial firm in Manhattan. But doors that used to fly open for me suddenly slammed shut. I sat across from a hiring manager at a top-tier investment bank who had practically begged to poach me a year earlier. He looked at my resume, nervously cleared his throat, and told me they were moving in a different direction. It took a sympathetic receptionist at another firm to quietly tell me the truth. My father had made phone calls to every board of directors in the city. He labeled me a volatile liability and threatened to pull his massive shipping contracts from anyone who dared to hire me. I was completely blacklisted from Wall Street. The financial strangulation was swift and absolute. Without my income, Liam and I had to pool his modest savings just to survive. We packed up our lives and moved into a cramped, noisy, one-bedroom apartment deep in Brooklyn. The radiator hissed loudly all night, and the subway rattled the thin windows every 20 minutes. But Liam never complained. We got married at City Hall with just 2 witnesses on a rainy Tuesday morning. There was no white dress and no lavish reception. Just us promising to build a life together. But the reality of our new life was harsh. I went from approving million-dollar corporate acquisitions to clipping coupons and calculating grocery budgets down to the exact penny. About 3 months into our exile, the past caught up to me in the most humiliating way possible. I was standing in the discount aisle of a massive chain grocery store comparing the prices of generic brand pasta. I was wearing an old, oversized sweater, and my hair was tied up in a messy knot. That is when I heard the familiar shrill laugh that made my stomach drop. It was my sister Brittany. She was strolling down the aisle clutching a designer handbag alongside her husband Jamal. They were entirely out of place in this neighborhood, probably just stopping to buy imported wine on their way to some luxury party. Brittany spotted me, and her eyes lit up with predatory glee. "Look, Jamal," she practically squealed. "I think we found a ghost." I tried to turn my cart and walk away, but Jamal stepped directly into my path, blocking me. He was holding an expensive iced latte and wearing a custom-tailored suit that he undoubtedly bought using his unearned vice president salary. "Wow," Allison, Jamal said with a cruel smirk. "Look at you. Daddy said you were living in the slums, but I thought he was just exaggerating." Brittany stepped closer, looking my cheap clothes up and down with exaggerated pity. "You poor thing," she sighed loudly enough for the other shoppers to hear. "Mom was just saying how embarrassing it is that you threw your life away for that computer repairman. If you are really this desperate, I could give you a couple of 20s to buy some real food." I gripped the handle of my shopping cart so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I am doing just fine, Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "And Jamal, you should focus less on my groceries and more on the company ledgers. I heard Harrison Global lost a major shipping contract last week because someone forgot to file the international customs paperwork." Jamal's smirk vanished instantly. His jaw tightened angrily because he knew I was right. His incompetence was already bleeding the company dry. In a sudden burst of spite, he took a step forward and aggressively shoved his iced latte toward me. The plastic cup crushed in his grip, and the dark, sticky coffee splashed all over my only warm winter coat. "Oh, my bad," Jamal sneered, pretending it was an accident. My hand slipped. "But hey, Harrison, Global is hiring temporary data entry clerks. If you need money to dry clean that hideous coat, you could come fetch coffee for me at the office." Brittany giggled, covering her mouth as they bumped past me, leaving me standing in a puddle of spilled coffee. I did not yell. I did not give them the satisfaction of a public reaction. I just wiped the cold coffee off my cheek, abandoned my shopping cart, and walked out of the store into the freezing rain. I took the subway back to Brooklyn, shivering and drenched. I felt utterly defeated. I pushed open the door to our tiny apartment, ready to finally break down and cry. But the words died in my throat. Our cramped living room had been completely transformed. Liam had pushed the old sofa against the wall and set up a massive desk holding 6 high-powered computer monitors. The screens were filled with rapidly scrolling data complex algorithmic models and global supply chain maps. Liam was typing furiously, his eyes focused and sharp. He looked up when I walked in and immediately rushed over when he saw my stained coat. I told him what happened at the grocery store. I told him how my family was trying to break my spirit. Liam gently took the ruined coat off my shoulders and looked me dead in the eyes. "They cannot break you, Allison," he said softly, "because they do not know what we are building." He pulled me over to the monitors and began to explain. Liam was not just fixing computers. For the last 2 years, he had been secretly coding a revolutionary artificial intelligence logistics algorithm. It was a system capable of routing global shipping lines 30% faster and significantly cheaper than any current model on the market, including the incredibly outdated system my father stubbornly relied on at Harrison Global. Liam had just secured the final patent. The technology was flawless and ready to deploy, but Liam needed a financial mastermind to build a company around it and take it to market without my father finding out. He needed me. I stared at the screens, watching the brilliant complex codes processing millions of data points in mere seconds. A massive fire ignited in my chest, burning away all the humiliation and despair I had felt at the grocery store. This was our weapon. I sat down next to him, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and immediately went to work. Using my decade of elite corporate finance experience, I structured a highly secure ghost holding company. I routed the ownership through several anonymous limited liability companies to ensure my family could never trace it back to us. We named the company Apex Solutions. I was no longer the disgraced daughter clipping coupons in a discount aisle. I was the chief financial officer of a tech startup that was about to completely blindside the entire logistics industry. We did not need to fight my father in his boardroom, and we did not need to argue with Jamal in a grocery store. We were going to systematically destroy their empire from the shadows, and they were never going to see it coming. Our new reality was a harsh, jarring contrast to the penthouse suites and corner offices I was used to. The Brooklyn apartment smelled faintly of old copper pipes and damp brick. Every time the subway rumbled beneath our street, the thin glass of our single-pane windows rattled so loudly we had to pause our conversations. I traded my tailored cashmere coats for a heavy wool sweater I found at a thrift shop. My mornings, which used to consist of analyzing global market trends over artisanal espresso, were now spent meticulously calculating our daily expenses at a tiny scratched laminate kitchen table. Liam was my absolute rock during this time. He took on freelance coding jobs, working late into the night just to make sure we could pay the heating bill. But the pressure was suffocating. My father had effectively erased my professional existence, and the silence from my former colleagues was deafening. I was a ghost in the city I used to help run. The true depth of my isolation hit me a few weeks later on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle of a discount supermarket, carefully comparing the price per ounce of two generic brands of rice. I had exactly $42 left in our weekly food budget. As I placed the cheaper bag into my wire basket, a sharp, familiar laugh cut through the hum of the store refrigerators. I froze. Walking toward me past the display of canned goods were my sister Brittany and her husband Jamal. They looked completely absurd in this environment. Brittany was draped in a designer trench coat, clutching a pristine leather handbag that cost more than my entire college tuition. Jamal walked beside her, wearing a custom-fitted suit and tapping away on his latest smartphone. They were likely just killing time while their driver waited outside, or maybe they had stopped to buy a specific imported wine. Whatever the reason, their presence felt like an invasion. I turned my face down and tried to quickly push my basket past them, but Brittany stepped right into the middle of the aisle, blocking my path. "Well, look who it is," Brittany announced, her voice echoing loudly enough to make an older woman nearby turn and stare. "Jamal, look. It is the runaway bride." Jamal slid his phone into his pocket and looked me up and down. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. "Wow, Allison," he chuckled. "Daddy said you were roughing it, but I did not realize you were actually shopping in the slums. Are you lost, or did the computer guy forget to give you your allowance this week? I tightened my grip on the handle of my shopping basket until my knuckles turned white. I am just buying groceries, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. Excuse me. I tried to step around them, but Brittany sidestepped to block me again. She reached out and touched the sleeve of my frayed thrift store sweater, with two manicured fingers pulling her hand back quickly as if she had touched something toxic. You poor thing, she sighed, feigning deep sympathy. Mom told her friends you joined a cult, but this is honestly so much worse. If you are really starving, I can give you a $20 bill. Just please do not tell anyone we are related. It is embarrassing. I stared at her perfectly powdered face and felt a surge of pure anger. I do not need your money, Brittany. What I need is for you to move. Jamal stepped closer, towering over me. He was holding a large iced coffee from an expensive cafe down the street. Do not talk to my wife like that, he warned, his tone dripping with unearned authority. You know, Allison, since I took over your old job at the company, we have been expanding. I actually need a new secretary to fetch my coffee and organize my calendar. I could probably convince Richard to hire you at minimum wage. You know, as a charity case. I looked Jamal dead in the eyes. I heard Harrison Global lost a major shipping contract last week because you failed to file the international customs paperwork on time. You do not need a secretary, Jamal. You need a miracle to keep my father from realizing you are bleeding his company dry. Jamal's smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed with sudden hostility. He took a deliberate step forward and sharply tilted his hand. The heavy plastic cup of iced coffee tipped over, and the dark, sticky liquid splashed all down the front of my sweater and jeans. The ice cubes clattered onto the linoleum floor. Oops! Jamal sneered, pretending to look surprised. My hand slipped. Good luck with the laundry. He grabbed Brittany's arm and they walked away, leaving me shivering and humiliated in the middle of the grocery store aisle. I did not cry. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I left my basket right there in the aisle, walked out into the freezing rain, and took the subway home. I was drenched, sticky, and shaking from the cold by the time I unlocked the door to our apartment. I was ready to completely break down. I wanted to crawl into bed and surrender. But when I pushed the door open, the words died in my throat. Our cramped living room had been completely rearranged. The cheap sofa was pushed against the far wall. In the center of the room, Liam had set up a massive workstation with 6 high-powered computer monitors. The screens were glowing brightly, displaying rapidly scrolling streams of data, complex algorithmic models, and intricate global supply chain maps. Liam was typing furiously, his eyes focused and intense. He stopped the moment he saw me and rushed over, taking in my stained clothes and shivering frame. I told him everything. I told him about the grocery store, about Jamal and Brittany, and about how my family was trying to strip away my dignity. Liam gently took my ruined sweater, wrapped a warm blanket around my shoulders, and guided me toward the glowing monitors. They cannot break you, Allison, he said, his voice burning with a quiet, fierce confidence. Because they have absolutely no idea what we are about to do. He pointed to the central screen. For the last 2 years, Liam had not just been doing freelance tech support. He had been secretly coding and refining a revolutionary artificial intelligence logistics algorithm. It was a completely autonomous system capable of routing global shipping lines 30% faster and exponentially cheaper than any existing model on the market. It was a direct technological counter to the bloated, severely outdated systems my father stubbornly relied on at Harrison Global. Liam brought up a simulation comparing his algorithm to the current industry standard. The difference was staggering. He had just secured the final patent that morning. The technology was flawless, secure, and ready to deploy. But Liam needed something he did not have. He needed a financial mastermind. He needed someone who knew the exact weaknesses of the corporate shipping world and how to build a company that could strike without being detected. He needed me. I stared at the screens, watching the brilliant, complex codes process millions of data points in mere seconds. In that moment, the cold, The humiliation and the poverty vanished. A massive fire ignited in my chest. This was our weapon. I sat down next to him, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and immediately went to work. I was no longer the disgraced daughter clipping coupons. I was a corporate predator who had just been handed the ultimate advantage. Using my decade of elite corporate finance experience and my intimate knowledge of Wall Street loopholes, I began structuring a highly secure ghost holding company. I routed the ownership through several anonymous limited liability corporations in Delaware and paired them with blind trusts to ensure my family could never trace the company back to us. I knew every single vulnerability in my father's company. I knew which shipping routes were over budget. I knew which international clients were frustrated with Jamal's delayed response times. I knew exactly where Harrison Global was bleeding cash. Over the next few weeks, our tiny Brooklyn apartment transformed into a war room. Liam managed the servers and optimized the code while I built the corporate infrastructure. I drafted aggressive pitch decks using a pseudonym and reached out directly to the very clients my father was neglecting. I offered them faster shipping routes, lower overhead costs, and guaranteed efficiency. Because our technology required zero physical warehouses and operated entirely in the cloud, our overhead was practically non-existent. We could undercut my father's prices by 20% and still pull in massive profit margins. We named our new entity Apex Solutions. We did not need to fight my father in his boardroom, and I did not need to argue with Jamal in a grocery store. We were going to systematically dismantle their empire from the shadows and take everything they valued. Fast forward 1 year, and the landscape of our lives had completely shifted. While Liam and I still maintained the outward appearance of our modest Brooklyn lifestyle behind closed doors, Apex Solutions was quietly acquiring massive government contracts. We were operating completely under the radar, securing million-dollar deals, while the rest of the industry wondered who this mysterious new competitor was. Meanwhile, the cracks at Harrison Global were starting to show. Industry whispers and financial news segments began hinting at their declining profit margins. Jamal's gross incompetence combined with my father's refusal to modernize their logistics network was a fatal combination. They were losing clients right and left to us, and they had absolutely no idea. I monitored their stock price daily, watching it dip lower and lower. It was thrilling, but the quiet was not meant to last. My mother was about to make a move that would force the final showdown. It was a Tuesday evening when the harsh buzz of our apartment intercom broke the silence. I glanced at the security monitor and felt an immediate knot form in my stomach. Standing on the cracked concrete stoop of our Brooklyn building looking absolutely terrified of her surroundings was my mother, Patricia. She was draped in a thick mink coat, holding her designer purse tightly against her chest, as if someone was going to jump out of the shadows and steal it. I hesitated for a moment before pressing the unlock button. I needed to know exactly what could possibly drag the Queen of Manhattan high society all the way to my neighborhood. A few minutes later, a sharp, rapid knocking echoed through our tiny hallway. I opened the door and my mother pushed right past me without even saying hello. She stood in the center of our living room, wrinkling her nose as she inspected our worn furniture and the exposed brick walls. She glanced over at Liam, who was quietly typing away at his massive multi-monitor workstation, and she let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Allison, this place is absolutely horrific," my mother said, pulling her coat tighter. "I do not understand why you insist on punishing yourself like this. You could have just apologized to your father and Jamal, and everything would have been fine." I crossed my arms and leaned against the front door. "I did not ask you to come here, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "What do you want?" Her condescending posture suddenly shifted into a desperate fake sweetness. She forced a tight smile and walked toward me, reaching out to touch my arm. I took a step back. She dropped her hand and cleared her throat. "Your father is dealing with some temporary cash flow issues at the company." She began, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It is nothing serious, of course. Just a minor restructure." But the banks are being incredibly difficult about approving a bridge loan. They are demanding more collateral than we currently have liquid. I stared at her, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. I knew exactly why Harrison Global was bleeding cash. Apex Solutions had just poached their top 3 international clients that very morning. My father was not going through a minor restructure. He was drowning in debt. And what exactly does that have to do with me? I asked. My mother took a deep breath. We need the Hamptons estate, Allison. The one your grandmother Beatrice left in your name. We need you to sign the deed over to the family trust so Jamal can use it to secure the bank loan. It is the only property that does not already have a massive lien on it. I actually laughed out loud. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering. For 2 years they had treated me like garbage. My father had actively tried to ruin my career. My sister and Jamal had mocked my poverty in a grocery store. And now, when their arrogant mismanagement had finally caught up to them, they expected me to hand over the only piece of security I had left. The Hamptons' house was a beautiful vintage estate right on the water. Grandma Beatrice had specifically left it to me because she knew my father would eventually gamble everything away on a bad business deal. Absolutely not, I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. You and Richard made it very clear that I was dead to this family. You cut me off, you threw me out, and now you want me to save Jamal from his own incompetence. The answer is no. My mother's fake sweetness vanished instantly. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She stamped her expensive heel against the hardwood floor. You selfish, ungrateful little brat! She screamed, her voice echoing off the thin walls. We gave you everything. We clothed you and fed you and paid for your elite education. You owe us that house. If you do not sign those papers, your father will lose the company, and it will be entirely your fault. I walked over to the door and pulled it wide open. The company is already lost, Mother, I said, my voice ice cold. And it is because you trusted a golden child who cannot even balance a basic ledger. Get out of my apartment. She stormed out, screaming curses at me all the way down the stairwell. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Liam walked over from his workstation and wrapped his arms around me. He did not say a word. He just held me while my heart pounded against my ribs. I knew my family. I knew they were not just going to walk away and accept defeat. They were going to retaliate. I was right. The very next morning, a man in a cheap suit knocked on my door and handed me a thick manila envelope. It was a formal legal notice from Jamal's corporate attorneys. They were filing a massive civil lawsuit against me, claiming that I had embezzled millions of dollars from Harrison Global before my departure. The documents claimed I had hidden stolen corporate funds in offshore accounts, and they were requesting an immediate freeze on all my assets, including the Hamptons estate. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate, malicious bullying tactic designed to bury me in legal fees until I surrendered the deed to the house just to make the nightmare stop. 2 years ago, this kind of threat would have terrified me. It would have sent me into a blind panic because I had no resources to fight a billionaire in court. But I was not the same broke, disgraced daughter anymore. I was the chief financial officer of Apex Solutions, and thanks to Liam's brilliant software, we were sitting on massive reserves of liquid capital. I looked at the legal papers, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Jamal thought he was trapping me, but he had just handed me the perfect excuse to completely destroy him. I did not call a defense attorney to beg for a settlement. Instead, I logged into my highly encrypted Apex terminal and began making phone calls to the major investment banks that currently held the debt for Harrison Global. Because of my father's rapidly declining credit score and his shrinking market share, his creditors were silently panicking. They wanted out of the logistics business before Harrison Global completely folded and left them with nothing. Using a complex series of blind corporate trusts and shell companies, I made those banks an offer they simply could not refuse. Operating entirely under the radar, Apex Solutions aggressively bought up every single outstanding loan credit line and corporate mortgage associated with Harrison Global. We bought their massive debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. It took less than 48 hours of intense, aggressive negotiations to finalize the paperwork. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing digital contracts on my screen. I had done it. I now literally owned the survival of my father's empire. If I demanded immediate repayment on those loans, Harrison Global would instantly be forced into bankruptcy, and my father would lose everything, including his own personal mansion. But I was not ready to pull the trigger just yet. I wanted them to feel safe and arrogant right before the floor collapsed beneath them. I drafted a very simple, legally binding response to Jamal's fake lawsuit. I did not mention Apex or the debt I had just purchased. I simply used standard legal jargon to request a 90-day extension for the discovery phase of the trial. I deliberately phrased the letter to make it sound like I was terrified, struggling to find a lawyer, and desperately stalling for time. I wanted Jamal to believe his bullying tactic was working perfectly. I wanted him to think I was backed into a corner, shaking with fear in my tiny Brooklyn apartment. A few days later, a heavy embossed envelope arrived in our rusted mailbox. Inside was an invitation printed on expensive cream cardstock. Brittany and Jamal were hosting a massive, lavish charity gala at the most exclusive country club in New York. The invitation included a condescending handwritten note from Brittany tucked inside the flap. It said they were inviting Liam and me as a charity case to show everyone how forgiving the family was, despite my pending legal troubles. They wanted me there so they could parade their ridiculous wealth and rub my face in my supposed failure in front of all their high society friends. I handed the invitation to Liam. He read the note, his eyes scanning the cruel words, and he raised an eyebrow. "Are we going?" he asked, a slight knowing smile playing on his lips. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a simple, modest black dress. "Oh, we are definitely going," I said. "They want to put on a show for their rich friends. I think it is time we finally give them one." As I stood in front of the cracked mirror in our Brooklyn bathroom, fastening the clasp of a cheap cubic zirconia necklace, I thought about the sheer irony of the night ahead. Brittany and Jamal thought they were inviting a broke, desperate sister to their high society gala to mock her. They had no idea that over the past 12 months, the power dynamic had completely inverted. While my family spent the last year hosting extravagant parties and buying custom sports cars, Liam and I had been quietly building a financial juggernaut. We did not buy fancy clothes or upgrade our apartment. We poured every single dollar of profit back into Apex Solutions. Our artificial intelligence logistics platform had evolved from a brilliant prototype into an absolute industry monster. We started by poaching my father's disgruntled international clients, but soon we were aiming much higher. Liam's code was flawless. It could map global shipping routes, calculate fuel efficiency, and bypass international customs bottlenecks in a matter of seconds. My father employed an entire floor of analysts to do what Liam's algorithm could do instantly. Using my immaculate corporate record and aggressive bidding strategies, I structured a network of blind trusts and Delaware shell companies to hide our identities. Then I went after the big fish. Within 6 months, Apex Solutions landed 3 massive government contracts. We were now optimizing supply routes for the Department of Defense, saving the federal government tens of millions of dollars while pulling in massive 8-figure payouts for our ghost holding company. We were quietly making millions of dollars every single month, yet I was intentionally wearing a dress I bought on clearance for $40. The contrast between our silent empire and my father's crumbling legacy was staggering. Every morning, Liam and I would drink our cheap coffee and watch the financial news networks dissect the rapid decline of Harrison Global Logistics. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. My father Richard was a stubborn dinosaur who refused to upgrade his legacy systems. He believed his billionaire status made him invincible to modern competition. Meanwhile, Jamal was running the finance department straight into the ground. Without me there to secretly fix his massive quarterly accounting errors, Jamal's gross incompetence was entirely exposed to the shareholders. The industry whispers had turned into loud, panicked headlines. I vividly remember watching a morning anchor detail how Harrison Global had completely botched a massive European freight delivery, costing the company millions in penalties. Harrison Global's stock was tanking. Their overhead costs were suffocating them, and their profit margins had completely evaporated. I knew exactly how bad it was, because I literally owned their debt. They were bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate, and Apex Solutions was the invisible predator swallowing their market share whole. My father was desperately trying to figure out what massive tech conglomerate was destroying his company, having absolutely no clue that the architect of his demise was the daughter he had publicly disowned. Liam walked into the bathroom, looking incredibly handsome in a simple off-the-rack suit he had bought years ago. He stood behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders, and met my eyes in the mirror. He knew exactly what tonight meant. It was not just a party, it was a reconnaissance mission. We left our cramped apartment and took the subway all the way to the Upper East Side, walking the last 6 blocks to the exclusive country club where the gala was being held. The crisp night air felt electric. As we approached the grand entrance lined with imported exotic flowers and dozens of luxury vehicles, valets rushed around catering to New York's wealthiest elites. We walked up the grand marble steps and handed our invitation to the imposing security guard at the door. He looked at our modest attire with a flash of judgment before scanning the barcode and waving us through the heavy gilded doors. The ballroom was a grotesque display of unearned wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, illuminating massive ice sculptures, and tables overflowing with expensive champagne and caviar. It was a charity gala in name only. The real purpose of this event was for my family to project an illusion of financial stability to their panicked investors and the anxious board of directors. As we navigated through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, I spotted my parents holding court near the center of the room. My mother was wearing a custom emerald gown, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent hedge fund manager. Beside her, my father looked absolutely exhausted. The deep dark bags under his eyes and his forced, strained smile gave away the immense pressure he was under. He was a man pretending his ship was not sinking while standing in water up to his neck. I noticed several members of the Harrison Global Board of Directors huddled near the private bar. They were not laughing. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, constantly checking their phones and casting nervous glances toward my father. The wolves were circling, and Richard Harrison was losing control of the pack. Before Liam and I could find a quiet corner to observe the crowd, a sharp, familiar voice pierced through the ambient classical music. "Well, I honestly did not think you would actually show up." I turned to see Brittany gliding toward us in a sparkling silver dress that probably cost more than a luxury sports car. Jamal was right beside her, swirling a glass of expensive amber liquor with a smug, arrogant expression on his face. He looked Liam up and down and let out a condescending chuckle that made my blood boil. "Look at you two," Jamal mocked loudly enough for several nearby guests to stop their conversations and turn their heads. "You actually wore a discount department store suit to a $10,000 a plate charity dinner. I guess we should applaud your bravery, Liam. I am surprised security even let you pass the front gate looking like that." Brittany pouted her lips in fake, exaggerated sympathy. "I told the caterers to pack up some of the leftover bread rolls for you, Allison," she said, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "I know things have been hard since Jamal had to file that lawsuit against you for embezzling from the company. It is just so sad watching you struggle like this. You look so thin and tired." I felt the eyes of the wealthy guests burning into me, waiting for me to break down or run away in tears. 2 years ago, I might have done exactly that, but tonight I was wearing my cheap clearance dress like a suit of armor. I looked at Jamal's smug face and then glanced over his shoulder at the nervous board members gathered by the bar. I knew something Jamal did not know. I knew that the ground beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes was about to completely cave in. I smiled warmly at my sister. "Thank you for the concern, Brittany," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the music. "But we are doing perfectly fine. In fact, we have never been better." Jamal scoffed, taking a sip of his liquor. Delusion is a powerful thing, he muttered, shaking his head. Enjoy the free food, Allison. Just try not to steal any of the silverware on your way out. He turned his back on us and began walking toward the board members, ready to schmooze and pretend he was a brilliant financial executive. I looked at Liam and he gave me a subtle nod. The trap was set. It was time to pull the trigger. I took a deep breath, smoothed the fabric of my simple black dress, and walked directly toward the private bar where Jamal was holding court. He was standing with 3 of the most senior board members of Harrison Global. I recognized them immediately. There was William Thorne, the chief investor, and Catherine Davis, the head of international operations. Jamal was swirling his drink and laughing confidently, puffing out his chest. We are projecting a 15% growth in our European markets by the end of the fiscal year, Jamal said, flashing a charismatic smile at the board members. We have completely streamlined the supply chain. I stepped right into the center of their circle. That is a fascinating projection, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured, especially considering the European freight division has been completely paralyzed for the last 2 weeks. Jamal froze. The smug smile slid right off his face. Allison, what are you doing here? He hissed, stepping toward me to physically block my path. Security is supposed to keep the charity cases over by the buffet. I ignored him entirely and looked directly at William Thorne. The 15% growth projection is a complete fabrication, William Weiss said. Harrison Global just paid a $3 million penalty to the customs authority in Rotterdam because Jamal failed to secure the proper export licensing for the entire quarter. Furthermore, the overhead costs for the new warehouse expansion have bled the liquid cash reserves dry. Jamal turned incredibly pale. He started waving his hands frantically. Do not listen to a word she says. He stammered, a thick layer of sweat forming on his forehead. She is a disgruntled former employee. She is literally facing a massive lawsuit right now for embezzling corporate funds. She is just bitter and trying to cause a scene. I offered a cold, practiced smile. The lawsuit is a desperate smokescreen Jamal filed to hide the fact that Harrison Global is defaulting on its primary bridge loans. Check the corporate registry, Catherine. Someone just bought up the entirety of the company debt. The creditors sold it off for pennies on the dollar because your vice president of finance cannot even balance the basic logistics ledgers. You are not expanding. You are sinking. Catherine Davis and William Thorne stared at Jamal, waiting for a confident denial. They waited for him to laugh and pull up the real numbers. But Jamal opened his mouth and no words came out. The absolute panic in his eyes was undeniable. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. What the hell is going on here? A loud, booming voice demanded. My father, Richard Harrison, came storming over, spilling his own drink in his rush to reach us. His face was flushed red with anger. He glared at me with pure hatred. What is the meaning of this? Allison, I told you to stay away from my investors. I will not have you poisoning my business contacts with your jealous lies. I am just giving them the actual financial reports, Richard, I said, standing my ground. Someone had to tell them the truth before they lose their entire portfolios. My father pointed a trembling finger at my face. You are a jealous, bitter failure, he yelled, his voice echoing over the ambient music. You are trying to ruin this company because you could not cut it in the real world. You are a disgrace to the Harrison name. He turned frantically to the nearest waiter. Get security over here right now. Throw this woman and her husband out onto the street. 2 large men in black suits began walking rapidly toward us through the crowd. I felt a warm, solid hand placed gently on the small of my back. Liam stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He looked at my father with a calm, chilling expression that completely silenced the raging billionaire. Do not worry, Richard, Liam said, his voice steady and low. We are leaving. We have no interest in staying on a sinking ship. But before you have us thrown out, you might want to check your email. Your largest domestic account just terminated their contract. My father sneered, crossing his arms. You are bluffing. You are a glorified computer repairman. You know nothing about my accounts." But William Thorne was already looking down at his phone, the color completely drained from the older investor's face. "Richard," William whispered, his voice shaking. "Richard, it is true. The Peterson account just pulled out. They cited massive shipping delays and went with a new competitor." My father snatched his own phone from his pocket. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as he read the notification. The Peterson account represented nearly 40% of their domestic revenue. Without it, Harrison Global could not even make payroll for the month. The illusion of wealth, the charity gala, the designer clothes, it all shattered in that exact second. Liam took my hand and we turned our backs on them. We walked out of the opulent country club, leaving my father Jamal and the panicked board members scrambling in the chaos we had just created. The crisp night air felt amazing. We took the subway back to Brooklyn and slept more soundly than we had in 2 years. The next morning, the dominoes finally fell. The financial news networks were buzzing with the shocking collapse of Harrison Global Logistics. Their stock plummeted by 60% before noon. The loss of the Peterson account, combined with the leaked rumors of their massive unpayable debt, sent their remaining investors running for the hills. My father was facing imminent, unavoidable bankruptcy. He was going to lose the company, his mansion, and his entire legacy. But Apex Solutions was ready. Using my anonymous corporate email, I sent a formal hostile buyout offer directly to the Harrison Global Board of Directors. We offered to buy the entire company, including all its physical assets and international contracts, for an incredibly low price. It was pennies on the dollar, but it was the only lifeline my father had left. If he did not accept the Apex buyout, the company would be seized by the bank by the end of the week. My father and his board had absolutely no choice. They scrambled to schedule an emergency pitch meeting with the mysterious executives of Apex Solutions, hoping to negotiate a severance package or maintain some small percentage of shares. They were desperate to meet the CEO, who was systematically destroying them. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a frantic text message from my sister Brittany. I had recently updated my professional profile online to simply read consultant at Apex. I did it on purpose, knowing they would eventually search the company name. Brittany wrote, "Allison, Mom said you work at Apex now. Please tell me you can help us. Dad is losing his mind and Jamal might go to jail if the new buyers look too closely at the books. We need you to put a good word in for us." I stared at the screen and laughed. For 2 years, they had treated me like dirt. They had mocked my clothes, insulted my husband, and tried to ruin my life. Now they were begging the charity case for a favor. I did not reply. An hour later, my mother showed up at my Brooklyn apartment. She did not look like a high society queen anymore. Her hair was messy, and her makeup was smudged. She pounded on my door, sobbing loudly. "Allison, please open the door. You have to help your father. You have to sneak his pitch deck onto the Apex CEO's desk before the meeting tomorrow. We are family, Allison. You cannot let us lose everything." I opened the door just a few inches and looked at her fake tears. "I do not do favors for people who disowned me," I said coldly. I shut the door right in her face and locked it. 5 minutes later, my phone chimed again. This time it was a vicious text from Jamal. He was terrified, but he could not stop himself from being a bully. Jamal wrote, "You better help us get this buyout approved, Allison. If you do not, I swear to you, when we meet your boss tomorrow, I will tell him you embezzled from us, and I will have him fire your broke ass. You will be back on the street." I typed my reply carefully, savoring every single word. "I will make sure the CEO sees this message. Good luck at the meeting tomorrow, Jamal." The stage was finally set. They were walking blindly into the ultimate trap. They thought they were going to a boardroom to beg a mysterious tech billionaire for mercy. They had no idea they were about to walk into a room and surrender their entire empire directly to the daughter they had thrown away. The thick stack of legal documents sat on my scratched kitchen table like a ticking bomb. Jamal and his high-priced corporate attorneys had gone to extraordinary lengths to fabricate an alternate reality where I was the villain. According to the 60-page civil lawsuit sitting in front of me, I had systematically embezzled over $3 million from Harrison Global during my final year as Director of Acquisitions. The document was filled with falsified ledgers and manipulated accounting records explicitly designed to frame me for the exact financial mistakes Jamal himself had made. The final page contained a legally binding demand for an immediate freeze on all my personal assets, including the vintage Hamptons estate my grandmother had left me. It was a masterclass in corporate bullying. Jamal knew I did not steal a single dime, but he also believed I was completely broke. He assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck in a Brooklyn slum, entirely incapable of hiring a defense attorney to fight a billionaire shipping company in court. The strategy was simple and ruthless. He wanted to drown me in so much legal terror that I would willingly sign over the deed to the Hamptons property just to make the nightmare go away. 2 years ago, staring at those documents would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have been crying on the phone begging my parents for mercy. But I was not that woman anymore. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute clarity. Liam poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat down across from me. He glanced at the threatening legal papers and then looked up at my face. He did not ask if I was okay because he already knew the answer. He just took a sip of his coffee and smiled. "So what is the play?" he asked. I slid the lawsuit into the nearest trash can. "The play is that we stop acting like the prey and start acting like the predator," I replied. I walked over to our massive multi-monitor workstation and booted up my highly encrypted Apex Solutions terminal. Jamal thought he was attacking a defenseless former employee. He had absolutely no idea that he had just picked a fight with the chief financial officer of an invisible corporate juggernaut. Apex was generating massive revenue from our autonomous logistics contracts, but until this moment, we had simply been hoarding our capital waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Jamal had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. Using my elite financial background and my intimate knowledge of my father's company, I began tracing the exact origins of Harrison Global's operational funding. My father operated his logistics empire on an incredibly archaic business model. He relied heavily on massive short-term bridge loans from major investment banks to cover his ridiculous overhead costs. It was a house of cards that only stayed standing as long as the company projected steady growth. But because Jamal's recent quarterly losses had severely downgraded the company's credit rating, those bridge loans were now categorized as high-risk toxic debt by the banks. The lenders were secretly panicking, desperate to get their money back before Harrison Global completely folded. I did not hire a defense attorney to fight Jamal's fake lawsuit. Instead, I hired a team of ruthless corporate acquisition lawyers through one of my anonymous Delaware shell companies. I instructed them to immediately contact the lead underwriters at the 3 major investment banks that held my father's debt. The instructions were simple. Apex Solutions was willing to buy the entire Harrison Global debt portfolio immediately in cold hard cash. Because the banks were terrified of my father defaulting, they were absolutely thrilled to dump the toxic assets. We offered to buy the debt for 30 cents on the dollar, and the banks accepted the terms without a single moment of hesitation. They practically tripped over themselves to sign the transfer paperwork. The entire transaction took less than 48 hours and was completely obscured behind layers of corporate blind trusts and non-disclosure agreements. I sat back in my chair and watched the final digital transfer confirmation illuminate my screen. The sheer magnitude of what I had just accomplished sent a thrilling chill down my spine. It was a surreal moment. At 35 years old, hiding in a cramped, noisy apartment, I had just legally purchased the absolute survival of my father's entire empire. I now owned the massive mortgage on the Harrison Global corporate headquarters. I owned the credit lines that paid his thousands of employees. I even owned the high-interest loan that financed his personal private jet. I held their lives in the palm of my hand. If I pressed a single button and demanded immediate repayment on those loans, Harrison Global would be forced into bankruptcy by the end of the business day. Richard Harrison would be stripped of his CEO title, and Jamal would be thrown out onto the street. But I was not ready to pull the trigger just yet. A sudden execution was too easy. I wanted them to feel completely invincible right before the floor collapsed beneath their feet. I needed to make sure Jamal remained entirely focused on his fake lawsuit, completely blind to the massive financial snare I had just wrapped around his neck. If he realized I had any money, he would instantly drop the lawsuit and try a different angle of attack. I had to play the role of the terrified broke sister perfectly. I drafted a very simple, legally binding response to Jamal's high-priced lawyers. I deliberately wrote it, without using official legal letterhead, to make it look like I had typed it myself. I did not mention Apex Solutions or the millions of dollars of debt I had just quietly purchased. Instead, I used standard, pathetic legal jargon to request a 90-day extension for the discovery phase of the trial. I explicitly cited severe financial hardship and an inability to secure adequate legal representation as the reasons for the delay. I practically begged the court for more time. I wanted Jamal to read that letter and picture me shaking with fear, crying over my kitchen table, desperately trying to stall the inevitable. I sent the letter via certified mail and waited. The response was faster than I anticipated. Less than 24 hours later, my phone buzzed loudly on the desk. It was an incoming text message from Jamal. He was so arrogant, so completely drunk on his own unearned power, that he simply could not resist breaking legal protocol just to gloat. I picked up the phone and read the message. "Got your pathetic letter, Allison. The 90-day extension changes absolutely nothing. You either sign over the deed to the Hamptons house by this Friday, or I will personally make sure the judge freezes every single dime you have left in your checking account. Have fun trying to afford a real lawyer on a minimum wage salary. You brought this entirely on yourself." I read the message out loud to Liam. We both looked at each other and started laughing. The sheer delusion of his threat was incredible. Jamal thought he was a brilliant corporate mastermind backing me into a corner. He had no idea he was standing on a trap door, and I was already holding the lever. I did not reply to his text. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against a narcissist. It deprives them of the reaction they desperately crave, and it makes them sloppy. By ignoring him, I guaranteed that Jamal would continue operating with reckless arrogance. He would continue falsifying the company ledgers. He would continue alienating my father's remaining clients. And most importantly, he would continue spending money the company did not have. The trap was perfectly set. The debt was secured. The enemy was completely blind to their own vulnerability. All I needed now was the perfect public stage to pull the lever and watch their entire fake reality shatter into a million pieces. And as fate would have it, my sister Brittany was about to hand me that exact opportunity on a silver platter. The Harrison family was preparing to host their annual charity gala, and I was absolutely going to be the guest of honor. 2 years had passed since the night my father threw the prenuptial agreement at my feet. I was now 35 years old and the architect of my own destiny. The invitation to the Harrison family annual charity gala had arrived wrapped in an obnoxious gold ribbon, but the real gift was the timing. My sister Brittany and her husband Jamal were hosting the event at one of the most exclusive country clubs in upstate New York. The stated purpose of the gala was to raise money for a children's hospital, but the actual purpose was to project an illusion of unstoppable wealth to their panicked shareholders. I stood in front of the small mirror in our Brooklyn apartment getting ready for the night. I deliberately chose a plain off-the-rack black dress that I had bought on clearance years ago. I wore no jewelry except for my simple wedding band. Liam stood beside me, adjusting the collar of an older suit that had seen better days. We could have easily afforded custom-tailored outfits and a fleet of luxury cars. Apex Solutions was generating millions in monthly revenue. But tonight was not about showing off our wealth. It was about weaponizing their arrogance. We needed to look exactly like the defeated broke charity cases they desperately wanted us to be. When we arrived at the country club, the sheer absurdity of the extravagance was almost funny. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to park a parade of imported sports cars. We stepped out of a standard yellow cab, right behind a roaring Ferrari. The entrance was lined with massive floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people earn in a year. As we walked through the gilded double doors, the sound of a live string quartet washed over us. The ballroom was draped in silk and illuminated by 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was a grotesque display of financial denial. I knew exactly how much debt was weighing on this room because I was the one holding the mortgage. We had barely checked our coats when the ambush began. Across the room, I saw Brittany scanning the crowd. The moment she spotted my cheap black dress, her eyes lit up with predatory excitement. She tapped my mother on the shoulder, and the two of them marched toward us, parting the sea of wealthy guests like royalty. Brittany was wearing a custom sequined gown that caught the light with every step. My mother was draped in heavy diamonds, looking down her nose at us before we even spoke. "Oh my goodness, you actually came?" Brittany practically squealed, her voice intentionally loud enough to turn the heads of the surrounding socialites. "I told Mom you would probably be too embarrassed to show your face, but I am so glad you swallowed your pride, Allison." My mother offered a stiff, fake smile and leaned in close. "Keep your voice down and do not touch the expensive hors d'oeuvres," Patricia whispered harshly. "We only invited you because it looks good for the charity photos to show that we are a forgiving family. Do not make a scene and do not ask anyone here for a job." I kept my expression perfectly blank. I did not glare or defend myself. I just nodded meekly, playing the part of the broken outcast to absolute perfection. "Thank you for having us, Mother," I said quietly. "We really appreciate the free meal." Brittany let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Well, grab a plate while you can," she mocked. "I know things have been tight since Jamal had to file that lawsuit against you. It is just so sad watching you struggle." They turned and walked away, immediately engaging a group of hedge fund managers in bright, energetic conversation. They had gotten exactly what they wanted. They had publicly asserted their dominance and paraded their impoverished sister in front of the elite. I looked at Liam and he gave me a subtle, knowing smile. The trap was working flawlessly. We made our way through the crowded ballroom, keeping to the edges and observing the room. The contrast between my family and the actual power players in the room was glaring. While Brittany and my mother took endless photos and Jamal loudly bragged about his fake success, the Harrison Global Board of Directors looked entirely different. I spotted several key board members huddled near the private bar in the corner of the room. They were not laughing. They were not drinking champagne. They were gripping glasses of scotch, checking their phones obsessively, and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. These were the men and women who actually understood the company ledgers. They knew that Harrison Global was bleeding cash. They knew about the massive unpayable bridge loans because they had been fielding calls from terrified creditors all week. They watched my father Richard standing across the room laughing with a politician, and their expressions were filled with absolute disgust. Richard was partying on the deck of the Titanic, and the board members could already feel the water rising around their ankles. I touched Liam's arm and nodded toward the private bar. "Let us go get a drink," I said softly. "It is time to make our presence known." We walked toward the bar where the board members were clustered. As Liam stepped up to order 2 glasses of water, a loud, booming voice cut through the ambient chatter. It was Jamal. He had left his circle of friends and intentionally followed us to the bar, determined to humiliate Liam in front of the most powerful people in the company. Jamal swaggered over holding a massive glass of expensive bourbon. He stepped right in between Liam and the bartender, deliberately knocking his shoulder against Liam's chest. "Well, look who finally made it to the bar," Jamal announced, his voice echoing loudly in the tense corner of the room. I was wondering when the IT guy was going to crawl out of the woodwork. "What are you ordering, Liam?" "Tap water." "Good choice. Do not want to overextend your budget for the month." The board members stopped their hushed conversations and turned to stare. They looked at Jamal with barely concealed contempt. Here was the vice president of finance, the man responsible for losing millions in botched quarterly reports, acting like an obnoxious fraternity brother while their stock prices plummeted. Liam did not flinch. He just calmly looked at Jamal and smiled. "Just getting some water," Liam said smoothly. "It is a long night." Jamal sneered, taking a large gulp of his bourbon. "Yeah, I bet it is long when you are standing around a bunch of people who actually contribute to society." "Hey, tell you what," Jamal continued, reaching into his tailored jacket pocket. "I know you guys are barely scraping by in whatever roach-infested apartment you rent these days. Let me help you out." Jamal pulled out his leather wallet, extracted a crisp $50 bill, and slammed it onto the mahogany bar top right in front of Liam. "Take that and ask the kitchen staff to pack up some of the leftover appetizers for you. Maybe some of the cocktail shrimp. That should feed you and Allison for at least a week, right? I mean, you guys need the charity more than the hospital does." A heavy, dead silence fell over the bar. It was an incredibly vile display of arrogance. The chief investor of Harrison Global, a stern older man named William Thorne, set his glass down on a cocktail table with a sharp crack. He looked at Jamal with absolute disgust. The sheer lack of self-awareness was staggering. Jamal was handing out $50 bills to mock my husband, completely unaware that the company he supposedly ran was defaulting on millions of dollars in debt that very night. Jamal looked around at the silent board members, completely misreading the room. He puffed out his chest, thinking they were impressed by his display of dominance. He picked up his bourbon and took another arrogant sip. I stepped out from behind Liam and walked right up to the bar. I picked up the $50 bill Jamal had slammed down. I held it up to the light, inspecting it slowly, while the entire corner of the room watched me. I did not look like a terrified, broken sister anymore. The meek facade instantly dropped. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and looked Jamal dead in the center of his eyes. It was time. The trap had snapped shut, and now I was going to bleed them dry right in front of the people who mattered most. I flicked the $50 bill back onto the polished mahogany surface of the bar. It landed right next to Jamal's heavy crystal glass of bourbon. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the room. I simply locked my eyes onto his and let 2 years of calculated restraint sharpen every single word I spoke. "Keep your money, Jamal," I said, my tone dropping to a dead serious absolute zero. "You are going to need every last cent of it to pay your defense attorneys when the Securities and Exchange Commission finishes auditing your fraudulent ledgers." The smug, arrogant smile on Jamal's face did not just fade, it completely shattered. He took a sudden step back, bumping into the brass rail of the bar. The 3 senior board members standing behind him immediately stopped their hushed conversations. The clinking of their ice cubes ceased. William Thorne, the chief investor of Harrison Global, narrowed his eyes and took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. "What did you just say?" William demanded, his voice thick with sudden suspicion. Jamal started waving his hands frantically, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking completely restrictive on his rigid frame. "Do not listen to a word she says." "William," Jamal stammered, a thick layer of sweat instantly forming on his forehead. "She is completely unhinged. She is a disgruntled ex-employee. We are currently suing her for embezzling corporate funds. She is just bitter and trying to cause a scene because we caught her stealing." I ignored Jamal's panicked rambling completely. I turned my body, slightly bypassing my brother-in-law entirely, and directed my attention straight to William Thorne and the other board members. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate executioner. "There is no embezzlement case," William Weiss stated clearly. "It is a fabricated lawsuit designed to distract you from the fact that Harrison Global is completely insolvent. Jamal has been cooking the books for the last 18 months. He told you the European freight division was projecting a 15% growth this quarter. What he did not tell you is that the company just paid a $4 million penalty to the International Customs Authority because he failed to secure the proper export licensing." Jamal's jaw dropped. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an escape route. "How do you know about that?" he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. I did not stop. I pressed the attack, driving the blade deeper. And that is just the beginning. I continued, my voice carrying clearly over the ambient classical music of the gala. The new warehouse expansion project in the Midwest was supposed to lower your domestic overhead. Instead, it bled your liquid cash reserves entirely dry. You are currently defaulting on 3 massive short-term bridge loans. Your corporate credit rating was quietly downgraded to junk status last Tuesday. The blood drained entirely from William Thorne's face. He looked at Jamal, and the sheer disgust in his eyes was palpable. Jamal, is this true? William asked, his voice dangerously low. Tell me right now if we are defaulting on our operational loans. Jamal opened his mouth to lie, but he could not produce a single sound. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He gripped his glass of bourbon so tightly, I thought the crystal was going to shatter in his hand. I delivered the final devastating blow. You do not have to wait for him to confess, William, I said smoothly. Check the corporate registry tomorrow morning. Yesterday, the 3 major investment banks holding your operational debt panicked. They knew Jamal had driven the company into the ground, so they quietly sold off your entire debt portfolio to a private equity firm for 30 cents on the dollar. You do not own Harrison Global anymore, William. The bank does not own it either. Someone else holds the keys, and they are going to liquidate your entire operation by the end of the week. Absolute chaos erupted in that corner of the ballroom. The other board members pulled out their phones immediately, frantically typing and making urgent calls. William Thorne slammed his glass down onto the table and stepped directly into Jamal's personal space, furiously demanding answers. The pristine illusion of the charity gala was completely destroyed. The wealthy socialites nearby began backing away, whispering and pointing at the sudden corporate meltdown happening right beside the open bar. Before Jamal could formulate a single pathetic excuse, a loud booming voice echoed across the room. What the hell is going on over here? My father, Richard Harrison, came storming through the crowd. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the veins in his neck were bulging against the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He had seen the commotion from across the room and practically ran over, spilling his champagne in the process. He pushed past William Thorne and glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I told you to stay away from my investors, Richard yelled, completely abandoning his polished billionaire persona. You are a jealous, bitter failure, Allison. You come into my event wearing cheap clothes and try to poison my business contacts with your pathetic lies. You could not cut it in the real world, so you are trying to tear down the empire I built. He turned frantically to a nearby waiter, pointing a shaking finger at Liam and me. Get security over here right this second. Throw this woman and her husband out onto the street. If they resist, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. 2 large security guards in black suits began pushing their way through the crowded ballroom, heading directly toward us. The entire room had gone completely silent. The string quartet had stopped playing. 200 of New York's most elite citizens were staring at us, waiting for me to break down crying or beg for forgiveness. But I just stood there perfectly calm. I had said everything I needed to say. I had planted the explosive, and now all I had to do was walk away and watch the building collapse. As the security guards reached us, Liam smoothly stepped forward. He did not raise his hands or act aggressively. He simply placed himself between me and my raging father. He looked at Richard with a calm, chilling expression that completely commanded the room. Do not worry about calling security. Richard, Liam said, his voice steady and incredibly powerful. We are leaving. We have absolutely no interest in spending another minute on a sinking ship. My father sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. Get out of my sight, you glorified computer repairman, Richard spat. You know nothing about my business. My ship is made of iron. Liam tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Is that right? Liam asked. Before we leave, you might want to check your email, Richard. Specifically, your messages from the executive team at Vanguard Logistics. You just lost your biggest domestic client. Richard froze. The arrogant sneer melted off his face, replaced instantly by a look of sheer panicked confusion. Vanguard Logistics represented nearly 40% of Harrison Global's entire domestic revenue. Without their shipping contracts, my father could not even afford to make payroll for the month. It was the absolute lifeblood of his company. "You are bluffing, Richard," whispered his voice, suddenly lacking all its previous bravado. Liam did not say another word. He just reached out gently, took my hand, and turned around. We began walking toward the grand exit of the ballroom. Behind us, I heard the frantic rustling of fabric as my father desperately dug into his tuxedo pocket to retrieve his phone. We were halfway to the doors when the sound hit. It was a loud, agonizing gasp, followed by the sound of a heavy phone clattering against the marble floor. I did not turn around to look, but I knew exactly what had happened. Richard had opened the email. He had seen the official termination notice. The empire he loved more than his own daughter was officially dead. We pushed through the heavy gilded doors and walked out into the crisp, cool night air. The valet rushed forward asking if we needed a car, but we just waved him off and started walking down the grand driveway together. The tension that had been building in my chest for 2 straight years completely evaporated. The night sky above us felt expansive and clear. We did not speak for a long time, simply enjoying the quiet rhythm of our footsteps on the pavement. We had walked into the lion's den dressed as sheep, and we had completely slaughtered the king. The next morning, the financial world woke up to a massacre. The news networks broke the story before the stock market even opened. Harrison Global Logistics was in a state of catastrophic freefall. The loss of the Vanguard contract, combined with the leaked rumors of their massive unpayable debt, sent their remaining investors running for the exits. Their stock price plummeted by 60% in a matter of hours. The dominoes were falling faster than my family could possibly comprehend. They were completely trapped, and they had absolutely no idea that their only potential savior was the very woman they had just tried to throw out of their party. We sat on our worn living room sofa, drinking cheap coffee out of chipped mugs, while watching the morning financial news. The ticker symbol for Harrison Global Logistics was flashing bright red at the bottom of the television screen, accompanied by a downward arrow that seemed to grow steeper by the minute. The anchors were speaking in hushed, urgent tones describing the catastrophic collapse of a legacy shipping empire. They detailed the sudden departure of the Vanguard account and the shocking revelation that Harrison Global's entire operational debt had been quietly sold off overnight to a private equity firm. The stock market had only been open for 2 hours, and my father's company had already lost 60% of its total valuation. I set my mug down on the coffee table and opened my laptop. It was time to throw the final anvil to the drowning men. I logged into my highly encrypted Apex Solutions terminal and authorized our corporate attorneys to send the official letter of intent directly to the Harrison Global Board of Directors. It was a hostile buyout offer of unprecedented aggression. I drafted the terms myself, deliberately designing them to be as ruthless as possible. Apex Solutions offered to purchase all physical assets, international contracts, and remaining infrastructure of Harrison Global for 10 cents on the dollar. The contract stipulated that we would assume their massive debt portfolio, but in exchange, the existing executive board would be entirely dissolved. There were absolutely no severance packages included. There were no golden parachutes. It was a brutal, uncompromising demand for total surrender. But because the banks were preparing to seize the company by the end of the week, it was the only actual lifeline my father had left to avoid total personal bankruptcy and potential criminal liability for Jamal's fraudulent ledgers. Within minutes of the email being dispatched, the walls of the Harrison Global corporate headquarters began to cave in. I did not have to guess what was happening inside that building, because my phone started vibrating with text messages from a few sympathetic former colleagues who still worked in the lower-level accounting departments. A junior analyst named David texted me a play-by-play of the absolute meltdown occurring on the executive floor. David wrote, "Allison, you would not believe the chaos here. Richard just smashed a glass vase against the boardroom wall. Jamal has locked himself in his office and is literally feeding months of financial reports into a paper shredder. The board members are threatening to physically remove Richard from the building. Someone named Apex Solutions just offered to buy us for pennies, and the board is forcing Richard to take the meeting. I read the text out loud to Liam. He leaned back in his chair and interlaced his fingers behind his head, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "So, they got the invitation," Liam said. "They did," I replied, staring at the screen. "Now the only question is whether they tried to negotiate or just beg." At the Harrison Global headquarters, the panic had morphed into sheer desperation. My father and Jamal were backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere to run. According to David, the board of directors had issued Richard a final ultimatum. He had exactly 48 hours to prepare a pitch deck for the mysterious executives at Apex Solutions. He had to convince this unknown tech conglomerate to finalize the buyout and assume the debt before the banks locked the doors. Richard was desperately trying to figure out a way to structure the deal so he could maintain a minority shareholder position or at least secure a multi-million-dollar exit package for himself and Jamal. They transformed the executive boardroom into a frantic war room. Jamal stopped shredding documents long enough to try and research the enemy. He scoured the internet looking for any information on Apex Solutions. He tried to find the names of the CEO, the board members, or the primary investors, but he found absolutely nothing. I had done my job too well. The entire corporate structure of Apex was hidden behind layers of anonymous Delaware shell companies and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. As far as the public internet was concerned, Apex Solutions was a ghost that only existed on legally binding digital contracts. But Jamal did not give up. In his desperate, frantic searching, he started looking through professional networking sites, hoping to find a mid-level employee he could bribe or intimidate for inside information. He typed Apex Solutions into the search bar of LinkedIn and started scrolling through the sparse results. That was when he triggered the trap I had set weeks ago. A month prior, anticipating this exact moment, I had quietly updated my own professional profile online. I changed my current employment status to read simply consultant at Apex Solutions. I deliberately chose the word consultant because it was beautifully ambiguous. In the corporate world, a consultant could be a highly paid senior advisor, or it could be a disposable hourly contractor hired to organize digital files and fetch coffee. Knowing my family's deep-seated arrogance and their absolute conviction that I was a destitute failure, I knew exactly how they would interpret it. When Jamal's eyes landed on my name on that screen, his desperate mind did exactly what I calculated it would do. He did not look at my Ivy League degree or my 10 years of elite financial experience. He did not connect the dots and realize that my brilliant software developer husband might be involved in a tech company. All Jamal saw was the broke sister he had mocked at the grocery store, the woman wearing a cheap dress at the charity gala, miraculously claiming to work for the billion-dollar firm that was currently destroying him. David texted me the update an hour later. David wrote, "Jamal just came sprinting out of his office screaming your name. He dragged Brittany and Richard into the conference room and locked the door. They were pointing at a laptop screen. I think they found out where you work, Allison." I smiled a cold, sharp smile. They had taken the bait perfectly. In their twisted, narcissistic reality, they genuinely believed I was a bottom-tier desk clerk hired to do data entry. They thought I was sitting in a cubicle somewhere sorting mail for the executives who were about to buy their company. Instead of feeling intimidated, their desperation morphed into predatory opportunism. They realized they had a Trojan horse inside the enemy gates. They spent the rest of the afternoon frantically assembling a pathetic pitch deck. It was a masterclass in delusion. Jamal tried to manipulate the graphics to make their catastrophic losses look like temporary market fluctuations. My father practiced his arrogant billionaire posture, determined to walk into the Apex boardroom and demand respect from whoever was running the show. But they knew their numbers were garbage. They knew the Apex CEO would likely laugh them out of the room unless they had an inside advantage. They needed someone to physically place their doctored pitch deck directly onto the CEO's desk before the official meeting. They needed someone invisible, someone low enough on the corporate ladder that they could slip into the executive suites unnoticed and leave the folder where it would be seen. They needed their desperate broke charity case of a sister. They completely forgot how they had treated me for the last 2 years. They forgot the insults the coffee spilled on my coat, the cruel jokes at the gala, and the fake embezzlement lawsuit Jamal had filed to steal my grandmother's house. In their minds, I was still just a pawn, a subordinate family member who existed entirely to serve their needs. They assumed that because I was poor, I would be desperate for their approval and terrified of their authority. The stage was perfectly set. Liam and I spent the evening reviewing the final buyout contracts. We had the debt portfolio legally transferred into our primary holding accounts. We had the termination papers for Richard and Jamal printed on heavy cardstock. We were completely ready for the final execution. I turned my phone on silent and placed it face down on the kitchen table. I knew what was coming next. The desperation was about to boil over from their boardroom directly to my front door. They were going to try to use me one last time, completely unaware that they were handing the murder weapon directly to their executioner. The heavy silence of our Brooklyn apartment was suddenly shattered by the harsh mechanical buzz of the front door intercom. I did not even flinch. I left my phone face down on the kitchen table, walked over to the security monitor, and pressed the screen. Standing on the dimly lit concrete stoop, looking completely out of place in her designer trench coat, was my mother. Patricia Harrison had actually lowered herself to visit the borough she constantly referred to as a wasteland. She was clutching a thick, glossy black folder against her chest like it was a shield. I pressed the button to unlock the main building door and waited at the top of the stairs. A minute later, she appeared in the hallway. She had clearly spent time in the car practicing her performance. Her usually flawless hair was slightly disheveled to give the illusion of frantic distress. Her makeup was deliberately minimal to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes. She looked up at me standing in the doorway and immediately forced a loud theatrical sob. "Allison, my sweet girl," Patricia cried, reaching out with her free hand as she rushed toward me. I did not step aside to let her in. I simply stood exactly where I was, completely blocking the entrance to our apartment. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at her. My expression was a brick wall. The sudden lack of an emotional response from me caused her to falter for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered and pushed forward with her script. "Please, Allison, you have to listen to me," she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I know we have had our differences. I know your father and I handled the wedding poorly, but we were just so stressed with the company. You know how Richard gets when his legacy is threatened. But underneath it all, I have always loved you. You are my daughter, my firstborn. I never stopped loving you." It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. In a span of 10 seconds, she had minimized 2 years of psychological abuse as a simple difference of opinion, blamed her horrific behavior on corporate stress, and weaponized the concept of a mother's love. 2 years ago, those words would have brought me to my knees. I would have done anything to hear my mother say she loved me. But standing there, at 35 years old, having built a multi-million-dollar empire from scratch, I felt absolutely nothing. It was like watching a bad actress forget her lines in a high school play. "What is in the folder, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. She sniffled, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She held out the glossy black folder. Her hands were genuinely shaking, but not out of sorrow. She was shaking with sheer terror because her wealthy lifestyle was hours away from completely evaporating. "It is the pitch deck," she whispered urgently. "Your father's presentation for the Apex Solutions Executive Board tomorrow morning. Allison, they are trying to buy us out for 10 cents on the dollar. If Richard does not get this exact proposal directly in front of the CEO, before the meeting starts, the board of directors is going to force him to sign the initial offer. We will lose everything, the house, the cars, your father's pension, everything." "And why exactly did you bring it to Brooklyn?" I asked, feigning complete ignorance. Patricia leaned in close, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing a sacred secret. Brittany told me you are working at Apex now. She saw your profile online. Allison, this is a sign. This is our family getting a second chance. I need you to take this folder into work with you tomorrow morning. Use your employee key card to get up to the executive floor and slip this right onto the CEO's desk before he arrives. You do not even have to talk to him. Just make sure it is the first thing he sees. I looked at the glossy folder and then looked back up into her eyes. The absolute delusion was staggering. She genuinely believed I was a low-level secretary. She was asking me to risk my imaginary minimum wage job, to break corporate protocol, bypass security, and illegally tamper with executive documents just to save the father who had publicly disowned me. She thought my desperation for her fake love would override my basic sense of self-preservation. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. For 2 years you pretended I did not exist. You watched your husband blacklist me from Wall Street. You watched Jamal spill coffee on me in a grocery store. You laughed with Brittany while she mocked my clothes at a charity gala. You let Jamal file a fake lawsuit to steal grandmother's house from me. But now, because you are about to lose your mansion, I am suddenly your sweet girl again. Patricia's face hardened instantly. The fake tears completely vanished, replaced by a sharp defensive glare. Family is family, Allison. She snapped, her true colors bleeding through the performance. You owe us. We gave you a privileged life. You are going to let your own father go bankrupt out of spite. No, mother, I said, stepping back and placing my hand on the doorknob. Richard is going bankrupt because he is an arrogant dinosaur who refused to adapt. Jamal is going down because he committed corporate fraud. And you are going down because you enabled all of it. I do not do favors for strangers, and I certainly do not do favors for people who threw me away like trash. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut right in her face. The sharp crack of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the apartment. I stood there for a moment listening. I heard her scream a vicious curse word followed by the sound of her expensive heels angrily stomping down the stairwell. I walked back into the kitchen and sat down next to Liam. He poured me a fresh glass of water and kissed the side of my head. He did not ask how it went. The loud slam of the door had communicated everything, but the night was not quite over. Exactly 10 minutes later, the phone I had left face down on the table began to buzz violently. I flipped it over. The screen illuminated with a string of incoming text messages from Jamal. My mother had clearly called him the second she got back to her car to report that the emotional manipulation tactic had completely failed. Jamal being the arrogant bully that he was, decided to immediately switch tactics and rely on pure intimidation. I opened the messages. Jamal wrote, "Patricia just told me what you did, you ungrateful little brat. You think you hold the cards because you got some pathetic desk job at the company buying us out. You think you can just shut the door on your family when we need you. Let me make this incredibly clear for you, Allison." The second message arrived a moment later. Jamal wrote, "You are going to print out the digital copy of the pitch deck I just emailed you. You are going to put it on your boss's desk tomorrow morning. If you do not help us get this buyout approved, I swear to God, when Richard and I walk into that boardroom tomorrow, I will personally tell the Apex CEO that you embezzled millions from Harrison Global. I will show him the lawsuit. I will have him fire your broke ass on the spot. You will be back on the street clipping coupons by noon. Do not test me." I read the texts out loud to Liam. The sheer absurdity of his threats hung in the air. Jamal was sitting in his office, completely surrounded by the wreckage of his own incompetence, desperately trying to extort the chief financial officer of the company that owned his entire life. He thought he was holding a gun to my head, but he was completely unaware that it was not even loaded. I picked up my phone to type my reply. I did not write a long paragraph. I did not argue or defend myself. I just typed 2 sentences that would guarantee he walked into the boardroom the next morning, vibrating with false confidence. "I will make sure the CEO sees this message. Good luck at the meeting tomorrow, Jamal." I hit send and immediately powered the phone completely off. I tossed it onto the kitchen counter and looked at Liam. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. We spent the rest of the evening in total silence, meticulously preparing for the execution. We walked into the bedroom and pulled our actual professional wardrobes out from the back of the closet, hidden beneath the cheap sweaters and clearance rack dresses we had worn for the last 2 years. Liam laid out his custom-tailored $10,000 Tom Ford suit, perfectly pressed and pristine. I pulled out my sharpest designer blazer and my favorite pair of expensive heels. We gathered the heavy stacks of legal documents, the incorporation papers for Apex Solutions, proving our absolute ownership, the massive debt portfolio contracts we had purchased from the investment banks, and finally the heavily researched, meticulously documented files of Jamal's corporate fraud, ready to be handed directly over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The anticipation in the apartment was electric. The 2 years of poverty, the cruel insults, the blacklisting, the public humiliations, it had all led to this exact moment. They were going to wake up tomorrow morning, put on their expensive suits, and walk straight into the belly of the beast. They were going to walk in demanding respect, demanding money, and demanding my termination. We turned off the lights in the apartment and went to sleep. The trap was locked. The snare was pulled tight. Tomorrow morning, the ghost empire of Apex Solutions was finally going to reveal its face, and the Harrison family legacy was going to burn to the ground. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Apex Solutions Tower in Lower Manhattan like a massive spotlight. Liam and I arrived at 6 in the morning, entering through the private underground garage to avoid any chance of an early encounter. By 8, we were standing side by side in the executive control room, looking at the wall of high-definition security monitors. The camera feeds covered every inch of the penthouse floor from the elevator banks to the main lobby. We did not have to wait long for the show to begin. At exactly 8:45, the private elevator doors chimed and slid open. Out stepped the Harrison family, looking like a funeral procession, desperately trying to pretend it was a victory parade. My father, Richard, led the group wearing his signature bespoke charcoal suit, but his usual commanding stride was completely gone. His shoulders were stiff and his face was drawn tight with exhaustion. Right behind him was Jamal, constantly wiping his forehead with a folded silk handkerchief. The custom suit Jamal wore suddenly looked far too big for him, as if the stress of his impending arrest had physically shrunk his frame. My mother, Patricia, and my sister Brittany trailed closely behind them, gripping their designer handbags tightly against their chests like life preservers. I watched the monitor as they approached the front reception desk. Even standing on the absolute precipice of total bankruptcy, they simply could not suppress their deep-seated arrogance. Our lead receptionist, a brilliant young woman named Hannah, smiled politely and asked for their names to check them into the visitor log. Instead of answering respectfully, Jamal actually snapped his fingers at her. He leaned his weight over the curved marble desk and demanded that she immediately bring them 4 black coffees. He then arrogantly instructed Hannah to page a low-level data entry clerk named Allison and tell her to come out to the lobby to carry their heavy briefcases. I listened to the live audio feed and felt a cold, sharp smile form on my lips. Hannah, who was perfectly trained and completely unfazed by rude executives, calmly informed them that the administrative assistants were unavailable and directed them toward the boardroom. Brittany loudly scoffed, complaining to my mother about the terrible customer service at tech companies these days. They were so blinded by their own toxic entitlement that they did not even notice the sheer scale of the operation surrounding them. Apex Solutions was not some tiny startup in a rented office space. We occupied the top 3 floors of a prime commercial skyscraper. It was a fortress of glass steel and cutting-edge technology that made the Harrison Global headquarters look like a dusty relic from the past. Hannah escorted them down the wide hallway and ushered them into the primary executive boardroom. The room was deliberately designed to be intimidating. It featured panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire New York skyline, and a massive, seamless mahogany conference table equipped with integrated holographic data displays. It was a room built for apex predators. The heavy glass doors slid shut, leaving the four of them completely alone inside. I switched the camera feed to the boardroom interior. The exact second the door closed, their arrogant facades completely melted away. Richard immediately slumped into a heavy leather chair, rubbing his temples in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. Jamal began frantically pulling thick, glossy folders out of his leather briefcase, laying them out across the pristine table. He was arranging the doctored pitch decks, trying to make the presentation look as robust and professional as possible. His hands were visibly shaking. He pulled out his phone, checking his messages over and over again, likely waiting for a confirmation from me that I had successfully smuggled his files onto the CEO's desk. I turned up the volume on the audio feed. "Did she text you back?" Richard asked, his voice rough and incredibly anxious. Jamal shook his head furiously, tapping the screen of his phone. "No, but she better have done exactly what I told her. If that ungrateful brat screws this up for us, I will personally make sure she never works in this city again." Patricia chimed in nervously, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "She will do it, Richard. She is desperate for our approval. She always has been. Just focus on the pitch. Remember to emphasize the European market expansion. Do not let them see the current quarter deficit." The sheer irony of their conversation echoed through the quiet control room. They were meticulously planning to lie to the Apex CEO, completely unaware that the CEO was standing in the exact next room, listening to every single word they said. They were banking their entire corporate survival on the blind compliance of a daughter they considered entirely worthless. They genuinely believed I was terrified of them. They thought their petty threats had worked. Brittany paced back and forth in front of the massive windows, her designer heels clicking anxiously against the hardwood floor. "What if they just say no?" Brittany asked, her voice pitching up with panic. "What if they look at the debt and back out?" "We cannot lose the house, Daddy. My friends think we are untouchable. I cannot move into a normal apartment." Richard slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, silencing her instantly. "We are not losing anything," Richard growled, his eyes wide and desperate. "We are the Harrisons. I built an empire from nothing. These tech kids might have money, but they do not have our legacy. We go in there, we project absolute strength, and we do not leave until they sign the bailout agreement. Jamal, you let me do the talking. You only speak to confirm the numbers." Jamal swallowed hard, wiping another layer of sweat from his forehead. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Liam reached over and muted the audio feed. He adjusted the cuffs of his $10,000 suit, checking the time on his heavy silver watch. He looked at me, his blue eyes sharp, calm, and completely focused. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. I looked down at the heavy leather portfolio resting in my hands. It contained the formal incorporation papers, the purchase debt contracts, and the complete devastating financial autopsy of Harrison Global Logistics. I had spent 2 long years sharpening this blade in absolute silence, and it was finally time to swing it. "I have never been more ready in my entire life," I replied. We stepped out of the control room and walked silently down the long corridor leading to the boardroom. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors, sounding like the steady ticking of a clock running out of time. The power dynamic of the universe had entirely shifted. I was no longer the discarded daughter walking away from a rehearsal dinner in tears. I was the executioner walking toward the chopping block. As we approached the massive double doors, I could see the blurry outlines of my family through the frosted glass center panels. They had stopped pacing. Richard was barking last-minute instructions, telling everyone to stand up straight and look successful. Liam reached out and firmly grasped the brushed steel handle of the boardroom door. He pushed it open with a heavy, decisive click that echoed loudly in the quiet space. Inside the room, all 4 members of my family instantly snapped to attention. They scrambled to stand behind the luxurious leather chairs, frantically plastering on their absolute best corporate smiles. They were ready to bow down and worship their corporate saviors. They were ready to sell their souls to the mysterious billionaires who held their lives in their hands. The heavy mahogany doors swung fully open. Liam stepped into the boardroom first, and the transformation was absolute. The man who my family had relentlessly mocked for 2 years, the man they called a broke IT guy and a parasite, walked into the room wearing a custom-tailored $10,000 Navy Tom Ford suit. The cut of the fabric was flawless, completely transforming his posture. A heavy silver Audemars Piguet watch gleamed quietly on his left wrist as he moved. He did not look nervous or intimidated. He walked with the relaxed, predatory grace of a man who owned the entire building and knew exactly how much power he held in his hands. I stepped through the doors a half-second behind him. I had traded my clearance rack dresses and thrift store sweaters for a razor-sharp black designer blazer and a pair of pristine high heels that clicked with authority against the polished floor. In my hands, I carried a thick black leather portfolio containing the Harrison Global debt contracts and the complete financial autopsy of my father's crumbling empire. We walked past the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the New York skyline and moved directly toward the center of the room. My father, Richard, was standing near the edge of the conference table. He had his right hand fully extended, preparing to firmly shake the hand of his mysterious billionaire savior. His face was plastered with the most desperate, eager fake smile I had ever seen. When his eyes registered that it was Liam walking toward him, Richard's hand froze completely suspended in midair. His eager smile rigidly locked onto his face as his brain violently rejected the visual information he was receiving. Beside him, my mother Patricia gasped audibly, bringing a trembling hand up to cover her mouth. Brittany just stared her eyes wide with total uncomprehending shock. Liam ignored my father's frozen outstretched hand entirely. He walked straight to the head of the massive conference table, unbuttoned his suit jacket with one fluid motion, and sat down in the high-backed leather CEO chair. I walked to the seat immediately to his right, the designated chair for the chief financial officer. I placed my heavy leather portfolio onto the table and sat down beside my husband. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system. My family stood frozen on the opposite side of the table, staring at us, as if we had just dropped out of the sky. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently and so rapidly that they were experiencing literal psychological whiplash. Jamal was the first one to break the silence. His arrogant brain simply could not process the reality of the situation, so his defense mechanism immediately defaulted to denial. He let out a loud, forced laugh that cracked awkwardly in the middle. He leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on the mahogany table. "All right, very funny," Jamal said, shaking his head. "You guys really got us. Seriously, Allison, did your boss put you up to this? Is this some kind of sick tech startup hazing ritual for the new buyout targets? You come in here dressed up in rented suits to try and rattle us before the real executives arrive." My father snapped out of his trance. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. The panic he had been feeling all morning was instantly replaced by his familiar, towering rage. He slammed his hand down on the back of his leather chair. "Allison, what is the absolute meaning of this?" Richard yelled, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "You do not work on the executive floor. Get out of those chairs right this second before the CEO walks in and security throws you both out of the building. This is not a game. I am trying to save my company, and I will not let my disgraced daughter ruin this meeting with a childish prank." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or shrink back from his anger. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool, polished wood of the conference table. I looked directly into my father's furious eyes and spoke with absolute total calm. "There is no one else coming, Richard," I said smoothly. Jamal scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Cut the crap, Allison. Where is the head of Apex Solutions? We do not have time for this nonsense. We are here to negotiate a 10-cent on the dollar buyout, and we are absolutely not wasting our morning talking to a glorified secretary and her computer repairman husband. Tell whoever sent you that Richard Harrison is ready to speak to the real boss." I turned my gaze away from my father and locked eyes with Jamal. The sheer, unearned arrogance radiating from him was astounding. He was standing in the middle of a burning building demanding to speak to the manager. I reached over and unzipped the heavy leather portfolio I had placed on the table. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. They were the Delaware State Corporate Incorporation certificates and the official board of directors registry for Apex Solutions. It was the undeniable, legally binding proof of total ownership. I placed my hand flat firmly on top of the stack of papers. I pushed the documents across the long, smooth surface of the mahogany table. The thick stack of papers slid perfectly, stopping right in front of Jamal's clenched fists. "Read it, Jamal," I commanded, my voice dropping to a cold, authoritative register. "Read the names of the primary shareholders." Jamal looked down at the documents. He let out another dismissive scoff, but he reached out and picked up the top page. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched as he found the section outlining the executive officers. I watched his eyes read the names Liam and Allison. The physical reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The blood completely drained from Jamal's face, leaving his skin looking like pale ash. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. His hands began to visibly shake, causing the heavy paper to rattle in his grip. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean heavily against the edge of the table just to keep himself standing upright. "What is it, Jamal?" my father demanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority. "What does the paper say?" Jamal could not speak. He just slowly lifted his terrified eyes and stared at Liam. He looked at the custom suit, he looked at the expensive watch, and he finally looked at the calm, calculating intelligence radiating from Liam's face. The horrifying reality of the situation crashed down onto Jamal, crushing his massive ego into dust. Richard snatched the paper out of Jamal's trembling hand. My father put on his reading glasses and looked at the document. He read the names. He read the corporate titles. He read the official signatures at the bottom of the page. "No," Richard whispered, dropping the paper onto the table as if it had physically burned him. "No, this is impossible. This is a forgery. You two do not have the capital to build a tech conglomerate. You live in a slum in Brooklyn. You buy generic groceries. You are broke." Liam finally spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of pity. "We lived in a modest apartment because we poured every single dollar of our profit back into the development of the Apex artificial intelligence algorithm," Liam explained calmly. "While you were buying custom sports cars and hosting lavish charity galas to pretend you were wealthy, Allison and I were quietly securing massive government logistics contracts. We did not need to flaunt our wealth, Richard. We were too busy using it to buy your entire industry out from under you." My mother let out a sharp, terrified wail. She collapsed backward into one of the guest chairs, clutching her chest. "You are the buyers," Patricia gasped, staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. "You are the ones who offered 10 cents on the dollar for the company. Allison, you are trying to steal your own father's legacy." "I am not stealing anything, Mother," I replied, my voice completely steady. "I am executing a perfectly legal, hostile corporate buyout. You drove Harrison Global into massive unpayable debt because you allowed Jamal to operate with zero oversight. You lost your biggest client because your shipping routes were incredibly outdated and inefficient. You destroyed your own legacy. I am simply the person buying the wreckage." Brittany finally found her voice. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of panic and rage. "You cannot do this to us, Allison," she screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "We are your family. You cannot just take the company and leave us with nothing. Mom said you were just a desk clerk here. You lied to us." I looked at my sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. "I did not lie to anyone, Brittany," I said. "You assumed I was a desk clerk because you are blinded by your own narcissism. You assumed I was broke because you desperately needed someone to look down on. Your arrogance was your ultimate weakness, and I weaponized it against you. I reached back into the leather portfolio and pulled out a second stack of documents. This stack was significantly thicker. These were the Harrison Global debt contracts, the massive bridge loans, the corporate mortgages, the high-interest credit lines that my father desperately needed to pay off to avoid total financial ruin. I dropped the massive stack of debt contracts heavily onto the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. 2 days ago, Apex Solutions quietly purchased your entire debt portfolio from the investment banks, I announced, stating the facts with surgical precision. We own your mortgages. We own your credit lines. We literally own the building you are standing in right now. My father stared at the massive stack of debt contracts. The arrogant billionaire CEO, the man who had completely controlled my life for 33 years, finally broke. His shoulders completely collapsed. He looked small, old, and incredibly fragile. He slowly sank into the chair opposite Liam, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. Jamal, however, was entirely consumed by panic. He scrambled around the table, rushing toward my chair. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Allison, listen to me," Jamal begged, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You do not have to do this. We can work together. I am the vice president of finance. I know the Harrison Global books better than anyone. Keep me on the executive team. Give me a consulting role. I can help you transition the assets. We are family, right? Please, Allison, do not fire me." I looked at the man who had mocked my husband, who had spilled coffee on my coat, and who had filed a fraudulent lawsuit to steal my grandmother's house. I reached into my portfolio one last time and pulled out a single thin red folder. I slid it across the table toward him. "You are right, Jamal," I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. "You do know the books better than anyone, which is exactly why I am not just firing you. I am handing this red folder directly over to the Securities and Exchange Commission this afternoon. It contains absolute, undeniable proof of your corporate embezzlement and your fraudulent quarterly reports." Jamal stared at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake. He backed away from the table, his breathing ragged and shallow. He knew his life was entirely over. He was not just losing his job and his wealth, he was going to federal prison. The boardroom was filled with the sounds of my mother's quiet sobbing and Jamal's frantic hyperventilation. I sat perfectly still in my expensive suit, sitting next to my brilliant husband, looking across the table at the ruins of the people who had tried to destroy me. The silence that followed was no longer deafening. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I did not let the sound of my mother sobbing or Jamal hyperventilating disrupt the absolute control I had over the room. I reached out and opened the thin red folder that lay on the table. The crisp sound of the turning page echoed like a judge striking a gavel. "Let us start with the third quarter of last year," I said, my voice cutting through their panic like a surgical blade. I looked directly at Jamal, who was still leaning heavily against the far glass wall of the boardroom. "You reported a net corporate profit margin of 8% to the shareholders. But you only achieved that number by illegally transferring millions of dollars in operational liabilities to a series of blind offshore subsidiaries. You effectively hid the company debt to artificially inflate the stock price. That is textbook securities fraud, Jamal." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, but he did not speak. He knew I had the exact transaction records. I turned to the next page. "Then there is the matter of the European freight expansion," I continued relentlessly. "You authorized a $2 million payout to a foreign contractor to expedite our licensing, except that contractor does not exist. The money was wired to an account in the Cayman Islands registered under a limited liability corporation that you personally control. You stole from your own father-in-law while his company was bleeding to death." "My father." Richard jerked his head up and stared at Jamal. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal finally registered in Richard's eyes. The billionaire CEO, who prided himself on absolute control, realized he had handed the keys of his empire to a con artist. Richard had sacrificed his own daughter, a fiercely loyal and brilliant financial mind, just to elevate a man who was quietly robbing him blind. "You stole from me," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of devastation and rising fury. "I gave you everything, Jamal. I gave you my daughter's hand in marriage. I gave you an executive title, and you stole from my company." Jamal raised his hands defensively, his custom suit clinging to his sweating frame. "Richard, listen to me. I was going to put it back." Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I made a few bad investments in the market. I just needed a bridge loan from the company accounts to cover my margins. I swear I was going to replace every single dollar before the annual audit." Brittany finally snapped. The realization that her lavish lifestyle was completely funded by stolen money, and that her husband was entirely responsible for the impending destruction of her family, shattered her fragile reality. She lunged toward Jamal, slapping him hard across the chest. "You idiot," Brittany screamed, her face contorted with rage. "You told me we were rich. You told me the company was doing great. Now we are going to lose the house because you are a complete failure. I cannot be married to a criminal, Jamal. My friends will destroy me." It was a grotesque display of selfish desperation. Brittany did not care that her father was losing his legacy or that laws had been broken. She only cared about her country club memberships and her designer handbags. Liam cleared his throat. The low, powerful sound immediately silenced the bickering on the other side of the room. Liam reached inside his tailored jacket pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and placed it deliberately on top of the final document resting in front of him. "The internal family drama is no longer our concern," Liam announced. He placed his hand flat on the document and slid it across the long, polished mahogany table. The thick stack of paper glided perfectly, stopping right at the edge of the table directly in front of my father. "That is the final buyout contract," Liam stated, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "Apex Solutions will acquire Harrison Global Logistics, its physical assets, its international routes, and its remaining brand equity for exactly 8 cents on the dollar. We will absorb the massive toxic debt portfolio that my wife strategically purchased from your panicked creditors. We will assume the liability for the company so it does not completely dissolve into bankruptcy by Friday." My father looked down at the contract. 8 cents. He muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. "I built this company for 30 years. It is worth billions. You cannot take it for pennies." "It was worth billions before you let Jamal run it into the ground," I corrected him sharply. "Right now, it is worth absolutely nothing. But the purchase price is only the beginning of the agreement. There are non-negotiable conditions attached to this bailout." My father looked up at me, his eyes red and rimmed with tears. "What conditions?" "First," I said, ticking the points off on my fingers. "Richard Harrison steps down as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. You will sign the transfer of power today before 5 o'clock. There will be no corporate farewell tour. There will be no golden parachute. You receive 0 severance pay, and your shares are instantly diluted to 0. You will walk out of this building today, and you will never return." My mother let out another agonizing wail. "Allison, please!" Patricia begged, leaning across the table with her hands clasped together. "You are taking our income. You are taking the company. How will we pay the mortgage on the estate? Where will we go?" I looked at the woman who had demanded I hand over my grandmother's vintage house just days prior. "I suggest you downsize, Mother," I replied coldly. "Maybe find a nice, noisy one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn." I turned my attention back to my father. "Second, Jamal is terminated for cause effective in this exact minute. Furthermore, this red folder containing every single piece of evidence regarding his offshore accounts and wire fraud will be couriered directly to the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission the moment this meeting adjourns. Apex Solutions will not harbor a criminal." Jamal let out a choked sob and slid down the wall, dropping into a crouch on the floor. He buried his face in his hands, weeping loudly, as the absolute certainty of federal prison crushed his spirit. Brittany stepped away from him, looking at her husband with pure disgust. My father stared at the silver pen resting on top of the contract. He looked at the paperwork that would strip him of his title, his wealth, and his entire identity. He looked at Jamal crying on the floor, and then he looked at me, the brilliant, capable daughter he had thrown away like garbage. Then the unthinkable happened. The proud, arrogant billionaire whose ego was larger than the skyscrapers surrounding us physically broke. Richard pushed his heavy leather chair back. His legs seemed to completely give out beneath him. He slid off the edge of the seat and dropped heavily onto his knees right on the carpeted floor of the boardroom. Patricia gasped, reaching out for him, but he ignored her. Richard crawled forward slightly, bridging the gap between us, until he was kneeling directly in front of my chair. He reached up and placed his trembling hands on the mahogany edge of the table. Real tears, thick and heavy, spilled over his eyelashes and ran down his deeply lined face. "Allison, please." Richard wept, his voice breaking into a hoarse, pathetic plea. "I am begging you. Do not do this to me. I know I was wrong. I was blind. I let my pride get the better of me. But I am an old man. This company is all I have. Please, Allison, we are family. We are blood. Give me a consulting position. Give me a small percentage of the shares. Just do not leave me with absolutely nothing." I sat perfectly still in the high-backed corporate chair. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I remembered the night of my rehearsal dinner. I remembered the sound of his crystal champagne flute shattering against the marble floor. I remembered the cold, ruthless look in his eyes when he threw the prenuptial agreement at Liam and told me I was dead to the family. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to his. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. "You made your choice 2 years ago, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper that commanded the entire room. "You chose a fraudulent golden child over your own fiercely loyal daughter. You chose the illusion of high society optics over actual competence. You threw me to the wolves, and you expected me to die in the cold. But I did not die. I learned how to hunt." I pointed to the silver pen on the contract. "You can sign that paper right now and avoid being indicted for criminal negligence alongside Jamal. Or you can refuse to sign it, and I will let the bank seize every single asset you own by tomorrow morning." Richard closed his eyes, sobbing uncontrollably. "Allison, please," he begged one final time. "Just a small severance, just enough to survive." I looked at him and delivered the absolute final blow, echoing the exact words that had severed my ties to this family forever. "You will not get a single cent from me." My father stared at my face, searching for a flicker of hesitation or an ounce of the daughter he thought he could always manipulate. He found absolutely nothing. His hands shook violently as Liam unscrewed the cap of the heavy silver pen and pushed it closer to his trembling fingers. The silence stretched for another agonizing minute before Richard finally picked up the pen. The scratching sound of the ink against the thick paper echoed loudly in the pristine boardroom. He signed his name at the bottom of the buyout contract, officially sealing the absolute destruction of his own legacy. Liam pressed a small button on the conference table console. 2 massive security guards entered the room immediately. They did not shout or use physical force, but their presence was a clear, undeniable mandate. My family was being escorted out of the building. Jamal had to be physically supported by one of the guards as his legs could barely hold his weight. Brittany walked out with her head bowed, completely stripped of her golden child arrogance. My mother wept openly, clinging to my defeated father's arm. When the heavy mahogany doors finally clicked shut, Liam and I were the only ones left in the boardroom. The air felt incredibly light. 2 years of suffocating tension had evaporated in a single morning. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and incredibly efficient. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Harrison Global Logistics ceased to exist as an independent corporate entity. The massive illuminated logo on the front of their headquarters was dismantled by a contracted work crew. The company was officially dissolved and its profitable physical assets were absorbed directly into the Apex Solutions infrastructure. The financial news networks ran the story around the clock, completely stunned by the aggressive ghost takeover. Industry analysts called it one of the most ruthless and brilliantly executed acquisitions in modern Wall Street history. They had absolutely no idea it was orchestrated from a scratched kitchen table in a noisy Brooklyn apartment. I kept my promise regarding Jamal. The moment the ink was dry on the buyout contract, our corporate attorneys couriered the red folder directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal response was immediate and overwhelming. 2 days later, federal agents walked into the lobby of the luxury high-rise apartment Jamal shared with my sister and escorted him out in handcuffs. The media had an absolute field day broadcasting his highly public arrest across every major news network. The subsequent federal trial was short and devastating. Faced with an absolute mountain of undeniable digital evidence detailing his offshore accounts and wire fraud, Jamal was forced to take a plea deal. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard federal prison uniform. For Brittany, the loss of her wealth was a fate entirely worse than death. The moment the federal agents seized their shared bank accounts, her perfect high society facade crumbled into dust. She did not stand by her husband during his trial. She immediately filed for a highly publicized and incredibly messy divorce, desperately trying to distance herself from his criminal record. But she had no independent income, no marketable skills, and absolutely no leverage. Stripped of her golden child status and her stolen luxury, she was quickly abandoned by all her wealthy friends. Her country club membership was revoked, and she was forced to pack her expensive designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. She had nowhere to go except back to our parents. But Richard and Patricia were facing their own brutal new reality. The meager buyout money they received was immediately swallowed by the remaining personal debts my father had secretly accumulated outside of the company. The bank foreclosed on their massive estate. The luxury cars were repossessed by the dealership. Even the vintage Hamptons property, the exact house they had tried to extort from me, was auctioned off to cover their outstanding legal fees. My parents were forced to rent a cramped, downsized 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Brittany moved into their tiny guest room. The three of them were trapped in a claustrophobic space, completely consumed by bitterness, blaming each other for their collective downfall. Richard sat in a cheap recliner all day, staring blankly at the wall, mourning his lost empire. Patricia complained endlessly about the thin walls and the loud neighbors. Brittany resented them both for failing to protect her lifestyle. The family that had bonded over their shared arrogance and cruelty was now tearing each other apart in absolute misery. I watched the fallout from a distance, and I felt absolutely zero guilt. Society conditions us to believe that blood dictates loyalty. We are taught that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our genetics, regardless of how deeply they cut us or how completely they betray us. But that is a toxic lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. My family had demanded my blind loyalty while actively trying to destroy my life. Cutting them off was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. Their toxicity was permanently severed from my life, and the silence they left behind was incredibly beautiful. Liam and I finally allowed ourselves to enjoy the fruits of our labor. We moved out of our cramped Brooklyn apartment, but we did not buy a gaudy mansion in the city to show off our wealth to the social elites. Instead, we purchased a beautiful secluded estate in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by acres of ancient trees and quiet rolling hills. Apex Solutions continued to dominate the global logistics industry, but we ran the company on our own terms. We prioritized innovation integrity and treating our employees with the basic human respect that my father had always lacked. A few months after the corporate buyout, I stood on the wide stone balcony of our new home, holding a warm cup of coffee. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain. Liam walked up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and resting his chin gently on my shoulder. We looked out over the sprawling green landscape, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind through the leaves. I leaned back into his solid, reassuring presence. I had lost a toxic family, but I had built a magnificent empire. True family is not determined by a shared last name or a biological obligation. True family is found. It is the people who stand by you when your bank accounts are frozen and your professional reputation is dragged through the mud. It is the people who see your immense potential when everyone else tells you that you are completely worthless. It is the partner who helps you build a tech conglomerate from a tiny desk in a noisy apartment, never once doubting your brilliance. For 33 years, I allowed my worth to be dictated by a father who viewed me as a corporate transaction and a mother who viewed me as an absolute inconvenience. I spent my entire youth shrinking myself down to fit into a box they designed to keep me under their control. But standing on that balcony looking out at the beautiful life Liam and I had built together, I realized my worth was never theirs to decide. I had to let their corrupt empire burn to the ground so I could finally build my own. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you? How did you take your power back? Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about surviving toxic families.